When you picture Ireland, you see fair faces, freckles, and red hair glowing beneath gray skies. But look closer along the western shores, in small villages facing the Atlantic, and you'll see something different. Dark hair, olive skin, eyes that seem to hold the sea and the sun at once. They've been called the Black Irish. For centuries, people tried to explain them. Some said they were the children of shipwrecked Spaniards. Others believed Viking blood had darkened over time. But when scientists looked deeper beyond the myths into their DNA, what they found was far older and far stranger. Hidden in Irish blood lies a genetic signature unlike any other in Europe, a pattern so rare, so ancient. Researchers call it one of the strangest DNA lineages in the world. It's a code that reaches back to a time before Celts, before Vikings, to the very first humans who set foot on Irish soil. Who were they? And how did their blood survive, untouched, through thousands of years of invasion, famine, and change? When it comes to the dark-haired, olive-skinned faces found along Ireland's western shores, legends have never been in short supply. They've drifted through centuries of storytelling, whispered in pubs, printed in old books, and carried across oceans by Irish emigrants. Tonight, we step into those myths to separate memory from mystery and folklore from fact. One of the oldest tales begins in 1588, when the mighty Spanish Armada set sail to invade England. Caught by storms and chased by English ships, dozens of vessels were wrecked along the coasts of Ireland. The story goes that Spanish sailors, dark-eyed, sun-worn men from the south, washed ashore and found refuge among the locals. They married Irish women, settled by the sea, and their children carried their Mediterranean looks forward through the generations. It's a romantic idea that the Black Irish are descendants of shipwrecked Spaniards, but the evidence says otherwise. Historians found that most of the Armada survivors were captured, executed, or repatriated. There's little record, and even less genetic proof, that they remained long enough to leave a lasting mark on Ireland's DNA. Still, the legend survives because it feels right, because every mystery demands a story. The next tale reaches further back to the age of Vikings. When longships landed on Irish shores in the 9th century, the chronicles spoke of two groups, the Finn Hoyle, the fair foreigners, and the Dubh Goyle, the dark foreigners. Many assumed that dark meant dark-haired, or even dark-skinned, and so began the idea that the Black Irish carried the blood of Viking raiders whose lineages somehow grew darker over time. Yet genetic studies show that Viking DNA, while present in parts of Ireland, forms only a small fraction of the Irish genetic landscape. The dark foreigners of the sagas likely referred to rival Norse clans, not to physical features. But again, the legend endures. It gives the mystery a face, an origin, a name. A third story is more modern, born in the 19th century during the Great Famine. When millions of starving Irish fled to America, Canada, and Australia, a strange phrase began to appear: Black Irish. In the New World, it didn't always mean dark hair. Sometimes it meant the poor, the exiled, the Irish who labored in the shadows. Some say it referred to those who intermarried abroad. Others that it was used with prejudice by those who saw the famine immigrants as a darker class. Over time, the phrase took on a new mythology, one that blended hardship and heritage into a single name. 3 myths, 3 attempts to explain what doesn't quite fit the image of the fair, red-haired Irish. Each story tells us something not about genetics, but about how humans make sense of difference. When science hadn't yet looked into blood and DNA, story took its place. But today, we have tools that those storytellers never dreamed of. Ancient DNA, genetic sequencing, and computer models that trace ancestry back thousands of years. And what they reveal about the so-called Black Irish is stranger, older, and far more revealing than any myth. In the early 20th century, curiosity turned into investigation. Anthropologists, historians, and archaeologists began to wonder, could there be something in the bones themselves that revealed the truth? It began with simple observation. In the west of Ireland, from Galway to Kerry, researchers noticed physical differences that didn't match the typical Celtic stereotype. Faces slightly broader, skin tones a shade deeper, hair darker, eyes more brown than blue. These weren't isolated cases. Entire coastal communities showed this look. Early anthropologists, working long before genetics existed, tried to map these features as clues to ancient ancestry. In the 1890s, a British ethnologist named Haddon noted that Ireland wasn't homogeneous at all. He described the people of the western seaboard as belonging to what he called the Atlanto-Mediterranean type, smaller in stature, darker in complexion, but still distinctly Irish. Others followed, Beddoe, Ripley, and later Kuhn, all arguing that long before Celts and Vikings, Ireland had been home to darker, earlier peoples who had come from the south, perhaps from Iberia or even North Africa. These theories were bold for their time, but without DNA, they were guesswork stitched together from skull shapes and folklore. And folklore in Ireland ran deep. Old tales spoke of the Fir Bolg, the Tuatha De Danann, and the Milesians. Mysterious races said to have settled Ireland long before recorded history. The Milesians, according to legend, came from Spain, warriors and wanderers who became the ancestors of the Irish people. The Fir Bolg were said to be small, dark, and strong, a description that echoed what anthropologists were finding in real life. Of course, myths can't be trusted as data, but in Ireland they often hide fragments of memory, distorted echoes of ancient migrations, half remembered across thousands of years. By the mid-1900s, archaeology joined the search. Burial sites began to tell their own story. In 1903, the discovery of a Mesolithic burial at Mount Sandel in County Derry revealed that humans had lived in Ireland more than 9,000 years ago, long before Celts ever arrived. Later, Neolithic tombs like those at Newgrange and Carramore produced skeletal remains of people whose features, even in bone, seemed subtly distinct from modern Irish. Scientists measured skulls, jawlines, and eye sockets. They mapped patterns comparing Western Ireland to Spain, Portugal, and Brittany. The results kept pointing in one direction, west and south, as though the ancestors of the Irish had come not from Central Europe, but along the Atlantic coast, following the sea. By the late 20th century, new tools emerged: radiocarbon dating, isotopic analysis, and finally, the first steps into genetic testing. And when DNA was extracted from ancient Irish bones, something extraordinary began to appear. The myths had gotten one thing right. The story did begin with shipwrecks and sea crossings, just not from the Spanish Armada or the Viking longships. It began thousands of years earlier, when the first humans to reach Ireland crossed water no one had dared cross before. For most of the 20th century, Ireland's origins were still a puzzle. Scholars debated who arrived first: the Celts from Central Europe, or earlier tribes from Iberia, but everything changed in the early 2000s. It began quietly, in laboratories across Dublin, London, and Trinity College. Scientists started extracting DNA from the teeth and bones of people who had lived and died in Ireland thousands of years ago. For decades, bones had been dug up, cataloged, and stored in museum drawers. Now, with new technology, those same remains began to speak. The first major breakthrough came from the sequencing of a woman buried in Ballinahady near Belfast. She had lived about 5,200 years ago, during Ireland's Neolithic period, when farming had just begun to replace hunting and gathering. When researchers mapped her genome, they were stunned. Her DNA showed that she was not descended from the later Celtic or Viking peoples, but from early farmers who had come from the Middle East, moving slowly westward across Europe, through the Mediterranean, and eventually reaching Ireland's shores. Her skin tone, based on genetic markers, would have been darker than most modern Irish, and her hair black. Yet her eyes were likely blue or hazel. She represented a genetic mix that no longer exists in pure form, a lineage that bridged the gap between southern farmers and northern hunter-gatherers. Not long after, another discovery deepened the mystery. DNA from 3 male skeletons found on Rathlin Island, off the coast of County Antrim, dated to around 4,000 years ago, the Bronze Age. Their genes told a different story. They carried ancestry from the Pontic Steppe, a region stretching from modern Ukraine to Kazakhstan, home to the Yamnaya people, the likely ancestors of the Indo-Europeans. These steppe migrants brought not only new technology and cattle herding, but also new language roots, the early beginnings of what would become Celtic. Here, in just 2 sets of remains, scientists could see Ireland's entire prehistoric transformation, from dark-skinned Neolithic farmers to Bronze Age newcomers, whose genetic imprints still run strong through modern Irish DNA. But something else was hiding in the data. When researchers compared modern Irish genomes to those of neighboring Europeans, they found something unexpected. Ireland's DNA wasn't quite like that of England, France, or Scandinavia. It was older, more isolated. The Irish carried some of the highest concentrations of ancient genetic markers anywhere in Western Europe. In certain Western regions, particularly in Connaught and Kerry, the genetic signatures looked as if they had been preserved, almost untouched since the earliest settlers. That's where the so-called Black Irish connection reappeared. In some of these coastal populations, scientists detected unusually high levels of haplogroup markers linked to ancient Atlantic migrations lineages shared with the Basque Country and the far western coasts of Spain and Portugal. These were not modern Iberian traces, but echoes of the first post-Ice Age humans who had followed the Atlantic edge northward, carrying their genes, tools, and seafaring courage all the way to Ireland. Modern Irish DNA, then, is not just Celtic or Viking, it's layered. Beneath the surface lies a genetic foundation built by Neolithic farmers, mingled with Mesolithic hunter-gatherers, and reshaped by Bronze Age and Iron Age waves. And yet, even after all that movement and mixing, one thing stands out: a small but persistent set of ancient markers, older than the Celts, older than the Vikings, and found most strongly in the West, the land of the so-called Black Irish. These genetic fingerprints tell of a people who survived isolation. While Britain was invaded repeatedly, Ireland remained more genetically stable. The Atlantic Ocean that once brought settlers later protected them from total replacement. Their bloodlines, tucked away in valleys and along rugged coasts, endured carrying fragments of an ancestry that may stretch back 10,000 years. To the scientists decoding these markers, Ireland became a living archive of Europe's past, a genetic time capsule that still preserves traces of Ice Age wanderers and Neolithic sailors. And those dark features, those olive tones and deep eyes, may not come from Spaniards or Vikings at all, but from people who arrived long before history began. When the glaciers finally began to retreat around 12,000 years ago, most of northern Europe was still a frozen wilderness. But along the edges of that ice, small groups of hunter-gatherers followed the melt-tracking herds, chasing warmth and searching for new land. Among them were the first people who would one day call Ireland home. Around 10,000 years ago, they crossed from what's now Western Britain or continental Europe, not by accident, but by intention. These were seafarers, navigating cold, gray waters long before boats were thought to exist. Archaeologists found traces of their camps near Mount Sandel in County Derry, tiny flakes of flint, burnt hazelnut shells, and the faintest signs of hearth fires. The air then was heavy with pine and birch, and Ireland was an untamed wilderness. But here's where the story deepens. DNA extracted from the bones of those early settlers revealed something astonishing. Their genetic signature did not match later Celts or Vikings. Instead, it pointed south to a population that once lived along the coasts of Spain and Portugal. In other words, the very first Irish were not northern invaders. They were descendants of Ice Age survivors who had sought refuge in Iberia during Europe's coldest centuries. When the glaciers melted, these hardy people moved north, hugging the Atlantic's edge, bringing with them dark hair, darker skin, and the deep brown eyes that still echo through parts of Western Ireland today. Then came another wave around 6,000 years ago. Farmers from the Near East and southeastern Europe began to spread across the continent, carrying livestock, seeds, and a way of life built on stability rather than survival. They reached Ireland too, intermixing with the hunter-gatherers who had lived there for millennia. But here's the twist. When scientists compared their DNA, they found that the old blood still dominated. The ancient Iberian line didn't vanish. It persisted. Those early dark-featured families, scattered along the coastlines and mountain valleys, blended with newcomers but never disappeared. This genetic blending shaped the foundations of what we now call the Irish people. And yet, deep within their genomes, that southern seafaring ancestry remains a whisper from a forgotten world, older than Celtic myth, older than the idea of Ireland itself. The land had begun to shape the people, but soon, the people would shape the land. Ireland's DNA didn't just survive time, it survived disaster. History would test the Irish people again and again, through centuries of famine, conquest, and plague. And yet, somehow, that ancient blood, the oldest in Western Europe, endured. When the Black Death swept through Europe in the 14th century, Ireland's population was devastated. Entire villages vanished, monasteries fell silent, and ancient Gaelic families were erased from the records. But in the far west, in the rugged, wind-beaten lands of Connaught and Kerry, people survived. Geography became a shield. Those same mountains and bogs that made farming hard also made invasion and disease slower to spread. Centuries later came another catastrophe, the English conquest. From the 12th century onward, wave after wave of settlers and soldiers arrived: Normans, Anglo-Irish lords, planters from Scotland and England. Each invasion promised to remake the island. But while Ireland's culture bent, its deep genetics did not. Modern DNA studies show that even after 800 years of English rule, the genetic core of the native Irish remained largely untouched. In rural regions, especially in the West, people still carried lineages tracing back to those first Iberian and Neolithic settlers. And then came the Great Famine of the 1840s, one of the darkest chapters in Irish history. Over 1 million people starved, and another million fled across the Atlantic. Entire towns were emptied, yet even this tragedy couldn't erase the genetic memory of the island. Many of those who emigrated carried their ancestral markers with them, spreading the ancient Irish genome to America, Canada, and Australia. Today, geneticists can still trace those same ancient signatures in Irish-descended families across the world. It's almost poetic. Famine, empire, and time itself tried to erase a bloodline born before history and failed. Ireland's isolation, once seen as weakness, became its greatest protection. The DNA that began with Ice Age voyagers and Neolithic farmers remained hidden, like seeds waiting for spring. When scientists began decoding Irish genomes in the 21st century, they weren't just searching for ancestry, they were opening a time capsule. Every cell carried whispers from thousands of ancestors, stretching back through millennia of survival, isolation, and quiet endurance. The results astonished them. Within the Irish population, researchers identified distinct genetic clusters, small, regional signatures that matched ancient migration routes. But the most striking patterns came from the study of haplogroups, those long genetic lineages passed through the maternal line by mitochondrial DNA and through the paternal line by the Y chromosome. Most Irish men belong to a Y haplogroup known as R1b-M269, one of the oldest and most dominant male lineages in Western Europe. But in Ireland, it exists in unusually high concentrations, up to 80% in some regions, and in a form slightly different from neighboring nations. This subtle variation suggests that the Irish branch split off thousands of years ago, evolving on its own, while other populations mixed and changed. It's one of the reasons researchers describe Ireland as a genetic island within an island. On the maternal side, mitochondrial DNA tells an equally fascinating story. Many Irish women descend from haplogroups H and U5, the latter being one of the oldest in Europe, tracing directly back to Paleolithic hunter-gatherers who roamed the continent before the first farms appeared. That means modern Irish women still carry the same mitochondrial signatures as the very first mothers of Europe, women who watched glaciers melt and forests spread across a young world. Even more intriguing are the small anomalies, unique combinations found almost nowhere else. Some Irish genetic profiles show a mixture of Iberian and North African markers, faint but undeniable. These are genetic fossils, remnants of the first Atlantic seafarers who followed the ocean's edge from Spain, Portugal, and perhaps even beyond the Strait of Gibraltar. This genetic mosaic, part Ice Age hunter, part Neolithic farmer, part Atlantic voyager, is what gives Irish DNA its mystery. It's not purely Celtic, nor purely European. It's something older, deeper, a blend that stands apart from all neighboring populations. To geneticists, Ireland isn't just another European country. It's a biological archive, a map of human history that stretches unbroken from prehistory to modern times. And within that map, one truth becomes clear. The so-called Black Irish are not an anomaly. They're a living link to humanity's earliest Atlantic explorers, the people who carried fire, language, and memory across the waves to a new world. To understand the Black Irish, you have to look beyond Ireland itself, out across the Atlantic, into the shared past of an entire continent. The genes that shaped Ireland's people are not isolated quirks. They are pieces of a much larger European story, one written in blood, bone, and migration. When scientists compared Irish DNA to samples from across Europe, they found striking connections not to the north, as many expected, but to the southwest, along the old Iberian coast. The same ancient haplogroups that define Western Ireland appear in northern Spain and the Basque region, among people who also possess unusually old and distinct genetic signatures. This isn't coincidence. It's the echo of a forgotten migration, the trail of Ice Age survivors who repopulated the Atlantic edge of Europe as the glaciers melted. That's why the Black Irish look different. Their dark hair and olive skin don't come from shipwrecked Spaniards or sunburnt Vikings. They come from the very people who once were the Spaniards, or, more precisely, from those who lived along the ancient Atlantic corridor long before the concept of Spain or Ireland even existed. They were Europe's first coastal wanderers, moving where the sea allowed, carrying their genes, their myths, and their resilience northward. Today, geneticists view Ireland and the Basque Country as two bookends of the same prehistoric journey. Both populations carry traces of a Europe that no longer exists, the Europe of the first hunters and the first farmers, the Europe before Indo-Europeans, before Celts, before history began to write itself. So, what does Black Irish truly mean? It isn't about color, invasion, or myth. It's about endurance, the survival of an ancient lineage that refused to fade. It means that within the Irish genome lies a chapter of humanity's oldest story, how our ancestors adapted, persisted, and carried their identity across tens of thousands of years.